area is a square mile in size, and so these burn blocks are on the order of about 800 to 1,500 acres in size. And so muckrow restoration goals for the area are to produce this mosaic of pine savanna and woodlands and grasslands. This kind of semi-open or an open condition used to be historically much more common in the Wisconsin landscapes. Now they're globally threatened. Barrens vegetation itself consists of grasses, herbs, and low shrubs such as sweet fern and blueberries. And there are a number of processes, human and ecological processes, that are making these much less abundant than they used to be. In particular, barrens historically were viewed as unproductive even for agriculture, and so they were commonly converted to pine plantations starting in about the 1930s with the CCC and then extending into the 1960s. Common practice at the time was to furrow those open barrens and then plant within those, and those furrows are still very obvious on the landscape to this day. The other process that's happening is, of course, is occurring across the eastern U.S., brought up to our attention by Nowacki and Abrams, this process of mesification where, due to fire suppression, a lot of these open and semi-open systems that had high light and a higher proportion of grasses, forbs, and shrubs have now are beginning to increase in the amount of canopy closure that increases the shade. And over time, that just makes that system more and more amenable to more mesophytic tree species that eventually decreases the flammability of those systems due to the litter and the humid microclimate. And in particular, the focus for this really is in this transition back and forth between these two open stages here and this closed canopy system here. So woody densification is a really important process. But it's not just woody densification. The other process that's occurring simultaneously is that conversion from grassland to forest increases the stratification of the organic layer into a forest floor. And so what that does is it increases the amount of water and nutrient retention over time and also reduces flammability. And so in terms of battling woody densification, some of the tools that we have available are prescribed burning, mechanical brush cutting, and this combination of brush cutting and prescribed fire, which is often referred to as a 1-2 punch, where they'll trim the brush back and allow it to cure for a season and then burn it the next year, with the idea that it will burn a lot hotter than it would have otherwise. And of course, there are other methods such as chemical or mastication and other things. But in this study, we're really focused on these two treatments, either prescribed fire or brush cutting plus prescribed fire. And so that begs the question of whether or not that increased soil heating that should occur due to the enhanced fuel loading can enhance restoration success. And theoretically, what intense soil heating can do is it can decrease duct thickness through consumption. It can decrease soil moisture and nutrients. It can damage below-ground woody tissues, and it can favor fire-adapted species in the seed bank. And so we had a lot of project objectives, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on this middle objective here, which is to investigate the second-order relationships between critical ecosystem processes relevant to pine barrens restoration and soil heating. So those include things like hardwood stem mortality, and then the resprouting response to that, seed abundance, diversity, and vitality within the seed bank, and then soil fertility in terms of a number of nutrients and as well as water retention. And I'll touch on some of these other project objectives as well. And so the study design, we had a total of 112 experimental plots, stratified primarily by these two features. So it would have been the historic state, what it used to be, which would either be pine, deciduous, or grassland system, and what it is currently. So either a forested woodland, or in that transitional brush stage, or as a grassland system. We also, in a subset of these, added a series of fuel treatments, which I'll explain in just a little bit. The experiments took place across 4 different burn units, stratified across 2 different years, 2016 and 2018, for a total of about 4,000 acres burned in total. Just real quickly, some cover type definitions. Our deciduous forest was essentially closed canopy deciduous forest with that deciduous forest history. We also had a pine woodland treatment, and so that's you see that in the lower right, where they go into a pine plantation and give it a pretty severe thinning to open the canopy up, target basal area on the order of say 30 to 60 feet per acre. And the methods that they applied were biomass removals, just to keep the fuel loading down within those treatments. We also had our transitional stage, and we used as our definitions the targets that the forest uses. So 70% is the point at which they would go in and do a brush cut treatment. And so you see on the right here we have an example of a very dense shrub site, whereas this other example would be on the lighter side, on the order of, say, 50% cover. But that does exclude the short, barren species that include things like sweet fern and blueberry. And then, of course, we had our grassland treatment, which included either savanna or grassland conditions, and with low shrub cover, hardwood shrubs less than 30%, again, excluding those short shrub species. And what you're seeing here is an example of a more sweet fern shrub-dominated barrens condition versus a grassland condition. Both are equally valid. And then in terms of our fuel treatments, those were applied to produce these heating contrasts that we could use to get at that question of soil heating. And so for our brush sites, these were areas that were brush cut, and you can see one of the treatments there on the order of about 10 tons per acre in that example. We also removed the brush from some of these sites that had brush cutting applied and then had standing brush controls. And then within our pine woodland treatment, we had our existing low fuels as well as fuel additions, again using this brush fuel type. Same thing for our grasslands, our typical low fuels, and you see an example on the right here of a fuel addition applied to a grassland system. And in the background, you can also see the furrowing that's still pretty evident on that landscape today. The scale of these plots are pretty large, about 20 meters radius, or about 1/3 of an acre in size. And so we also included reference plots to capture the bounds of MOCR conditions and also to serve as non-burn controls for those restoration stages. And those include 3 different closed canopy conditions: hardwood, naturally regenerated pine, and pine plantations, as well as the treatments that are occurring within the restoration area. So those thin pine plantations, or that brush transitional stage, and also open grassland. And so this is what the distribution of plots look like. And so in orange, you see the plots in blocks I and F that were burned in 2016. And in blue, you see the plots that were burned in 2018 in blocks J and D. And this photo is just an overflight of the burn unit D about 2 days after the fire. And you can actually see here the signature, that ash signature of one of our fuel treatments on the ground. In white around the perimeter, you see where our reference plots were located. In terms of our plot layout, we fired a Fireman protocol, including measuring large trees, our fuel transects, and shrub sapling belts that went along with that. And then our more intensively measured meter squared vegetation quadrats, where we also measured fire severity post-burn. And so this would be an example of a fire severity plot, looking at that square meter quadrat. And right here in the center, you'll see the paint tags that we had installed with heat temperature or temperature-sensitive paints on those, as well as duff consumption pins. We did some post-burn ash sampling, and on a subset of plots, we had instrumentation such as soil thermocouples. And so this is what one of the burns looks like. This would be in Block F in 2016, just the day after the burn. In the background, you can see Block I that's currently burning. Just to give you a sense of the fuel moisture conditions, about 10% fuel moisture or 10-hour fuels, about 45% in the duff moisture. And here you're looking at a fuel addition plot within a grassland. You can see in that center where that radiometer tower is installed. Okay, and in terms of how well the fuel additions did to provide contrast, they did a really nice job. And so you see in the upper left where we had kind of regular Barron's fuels with very low flame lengths. If you move to the right, you can see much higher flame lengths once brush was added to those kinds of sites, and some more extreme fire behavior, probably on the high end of surface fire behavior in some of the more heavily brush fuel treatments down below. So what are the consequences of that enhanced fuel? Well, the really obvious ones is we got really high woody fuel consumption on the order of, say, 5 to 10 tons per acre were consumed. And so that certainly enhanced the burn severity. You can see on the lower portion of the slide the National Park Service metric that we use to quantify severity increasing as you move to the right. And it also certainly enhanced the ash loading on those sites as a consequence. And then the question was whether or not it influenced some of these other restoration objectives as well. And so in terms of how much duff was consumed, not very much. Duff consumption was generally low, less than a centimeter or certainly less than a half an inch. For the most part, it was on the order of about, say, 0.2 inches. We did find that the National Park System Severity Index did capture that severity quite well, and so we did have higher duff consumption in areas that were more severely burned. In terms of how effective it was for decreasing shrub density, in terms of top kill, very effective. So fire caused near elimination of all the hardwood stems across the board. Didn't matter how hot the fire was. In terms of below ground, not very effective. And so if you look at the amount of stems per acre beforehand, we had virtually 100% top kill during the fire, but by 1 year post-burn, essentially across the board, irrespective of any of the treatments, we got densities that matched the pre-fire densities. In terms of how it affected the seed bank, these were seeds that were sampled and then grown out in the greenhouse. And what you see is that duff contains the majority of the germinants within the seed bank, but there are some in the top 5 centimeters of the mineral soil as well. But that the burn intensities really had virtually no influence, and so pre and post burn there was no real effect that we saw in terms of the number of germinants that were coming up. In terms of the composition, the species that came up were common to the barrens. Rare or sensitive species really weren't detected. And so some of the take-home message from the vegetation side is that sprouting trees and shrubs are resilient to top kill only disturbances. So these late dormant season fires had minimal effects on total woody stem composition and density as soon as a year post-burn. And so that suggests considering, say, growing season fire or other methods like mechanical or chemical to address the woody encroachment issue. Of course, it is very effective for top kill. In terms of the seed bank, the duff and upper mineral soil layers certainly are seed sources for common plants of the pine barrens, but the late dormant season burns that were applied really had minimal effect on the total seed bank composition and density. And so that suggests for rare or sensitive plant species, continue to use some of these other restoration methods such as overseeding, planting, and other methods. So the question really is, why didn't we see a stronger below-ground ecological response to burn intensity? If you look at this cartoon, it gives a clue. And so there's, of course, the root system is below the duff layer virtually within the mineral soil. And if you have very low duff consumption, there's a good chance that the duff is actually insulating that to the extent that you don't have much damage below ground. And of course, heat rises as well, and so it's difficult to get that heat to penetrate downwards as opposed to upwards. And so that what's true for the hardwood stems is also true for the seed bank, since they're in the same layer as well. And so in a lot of studies, this is where it would end. We'd conjecture as to what the response was below ground, but in our case, we can provide some insights there. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Matt Dickinson.
Hi, I'm with the Northern Research Station based in Delaware, Ohio, and so have been working with Brian and Michigan State on this project, particularly with fire behavior and monitoring soil heating. So the dust that's accumulated in these forested stands can either serve as an insulator or as a source for soil heating. And if there's no combustion of the dust, the dust would tend to impede soil heating. If there's independent dust smoldering, then it will often increase soil heating a lot. And that independent dust smoldering, occurs at very slow rates after the main flame front has passed. So so we want to know what is dust doing in this system during fires. Going back to a classic paper, Hartford and Franzen had a couple situations. One was flash over moist stuff, where they had very intense fire, high consumption, but there was minimal soil heating. Their other situation was litter over dry dust, and they had low intensity fires, yet they had independent dust smoldering, and they had a lot of soil heating. So where on this spectrum are these MUCWA dormancies and fires? So there are two sources of data that I'll talk about on this here today. And one is thick thermocouple probes that are in the flames. They respond smoothly to fire heating, and through calibration, we can estimate fuel consumption, fire line intensity, flame residence time on a very local scale. So the heating that's close to these things is what's going to will be most reflected in the data. Then we also had thin thermocouple probes on the right-hand side here, and those were inserted as close as possible to the interface between the duct and the soil. Usually it worked. Sometimes the thermocouple wandered, so we'll get either dust measurement or a soil measurement. But for the moment, all the data you'll see are all the measurements that we collected. So the data are from these severity plots that Brian mentioned, and the data I'll show are not averaged across the larger plots. They're just for these essentially point measurements at the severity plot level. Now, there was a big range in fire behavior and soil heating. On the right, these are so they're pretty much the extremes of low intensity on the top, barrens under maintenance, and then brush cut hardwood invaded stands on the bottom. So consumption range at this local scale, not the plot average scale, that's what Brian was talking about, was from 0 locations that didn't burn to up to 40 tons per acre. Intensities, quite a bit of range there as well. And duct moisture content, quite a bit of range, 21 to 110%. The duct depth before the fire was ranged up to about up to about 2.5 inches. Duct consumption was on average 0.2 of an inch, but there were some local places that got an inch and a half of duct consumption. Soil temperature rise, also quite variable. So soil temperature rise is a convenient way to summarize soil heating And the baseline here is what the pre-fire temperature at the thermocouple was, and then the rise is the rise up to the peak. And so the variability in that temperature rise was primarily explained by fuel consumption locally, woody, herbaceous, litter, everything, and then the depth of the measurement. Depth of the measurement was the most influential variable, had the most control on the outcome in our studies. So here's an example. So here's depth. The figure showing depth on the x-axis and temperature rise on the y-axis. So we want to summarize the data in a way that's reflective of impact, biological impact, or chemical impact. In this case, what I'll show is a series of slides on expected impact on microbial communities. And so this is based on a cell population survival model and the effects of elevated temperatures on protein denaturation. So on these three-dimensional figures here, on the right-hand side is depth in inches, and on the bottom axis is consumption in tons per acre. That's all fuel, woody fuel, herbaceous, litter, et cetera. And on the vertical axis, there's whether you would expect that microbial unit, the community to sort of survive the heating or have substantial thermal cell mortality. And that ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 being minimal to no heating effect. So this polygon here, number 6, is the grassland treatment where grasslands under maintenance burning were monitored. And so you can see the range in depth from 0 to less than 1 inch, and consumption up to about 6 or so tons per acre. So from at the local scale. And so as you can see that as you go deeper for those low consumption levels, you end up having minimal heat impacts pretty quickly as dust depth increases. So now moving into the treatments with higher fuel consumption, this is a conifer brush cut and leave, and higher range of depth of the duff, as you can see, and also a larger range in consumption. So we're starting to get areas or local places where there's a lot of consumption, and the duff depth is not too great, and so you would expect some impact on microbial communities in those areas. Finally, this is conifer plantation, pine plantations with added fuels, and we see the kind of the full range in in fuel consumption, locally, and then a wide range in duff depth. So, again, locally, we're getting more areas where you've got even higher consumption and very little duff to insulate the soil, with probable substantial effects on kind of near-surface microbial communities. More work I need to do here with dormant seeds and woody stem impacts. Dormant seeds are notoriously heat tolerant, and that may extend to microbial spores as well. And woody stem impacts are kind of mitigated by insulation, by the fact that they're cool when the fire passes by, and that the duff the bark insulates the cambium and the root collar. So a couple more steps are needed for this, but for both dormant seeds and woody stems, you would expect greater survival at high consumption and low duff depth, just because of that. Either they're more thermally tolerant, as as dormant seeds, or that they're insulated as our woody stems. So, and kind of concluding here, where are we on this spectrum of soil heating? And we're definitely in a lot of places in the slash over moist duff regime, and we got minimal soil heating. But there were areas where there was slash over minimal duff, and we got what I expect are significant microbial impacts near the surface that we'll be looking for in the soil productivity or soil nutrient status and information that Kathleen will present. So duff is a good insulator, but only if it's thick enough. So with that, the last thought before Kathleen starts is we have seasonal information on soil heating, and when you burn in the middle of the growing season here in the middle of this figure, you're a lot closer to temperatures like 60 degrees Celsius where you would expect some significant biological impact. So for that reason alone, and because duff is often drier and warmer in those seasons, we would expect to start seeing some of that independent duff smoldering. So we're interested in moving to that growing season burns. So with that, I will turn it over to Kathleen.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, this is Kathleen Quigley. I'm at Michigan State University. I'm a postdoc here working with Jessica Meisel, and I'm also working with Randy Kolka from the Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids. And so we've already discussed that these late dormant season fires are resulting in woody fuel consumption and top kill of those woody fuels, and also limited duff consumption and soil heating. But what our team is really interested in is what is happening below ground where changes might be a lot less apparent. So this image from the left here is from a 1970 publication, and it's implicating soil conditions in woody encroachment of pine barrens. And that's important because fire is going to act to maintain soil conditions that allow native pine barrens plant communities to persist on the landscape. So we've discussed fire behavior, soil heating, and vegetation. What's important is that you can think of soils as kind of a missing piece of this restoration puzzle moving forward. This is a map from the Wisconsin DNR. It's the ecological landscapes of Wisconsin. We are working in the Northwest Sands. This is where the Moqua Barrens are located. And soils here are glacial outwash. They're about 10,000 years old. They are considered excessively drained, which means that they do not hold much water, and they are barren of nutrients. So they're called barrens because they don't have good fertility, which is the combined effect of poor water holding status and poor nutrient status. Native pine barrens plant communities are really well adapted to these soils, though, especially those conditions of drought and nutrient poor soil status, as well as fire. So our overarching goal is to understand how prescribed fire alters soil properties, and we want to know how soils are changing after fire, but also 1 year after burns, so we can understand the persistence of the effects that we observe. And as Brian mentioned, we're also monitoring a set of reference plots, which have been long unburned. We can compare our restored burned plots to those reference plots. This is just a quick overview of our soil sampling design. This is within a single 1 meter square quadrat that's located near the center of each plot where we do our sampling. The first thing you'll notice is this lighter colored ring. That's where we've removed forest floor from within a 30 centimeter soil sampling ring. And forest floor is going to include all the organic material contained in litter, duff, and the soil organic horizon. After that, we use a soil hammer to remove mineral soil cores from below that surface. And then we divide those into an upper mineral soil fraction and a lower mineral soil fraction. So those are our 0 to 5 and 5 to 10 portions. We also have these PRS probes installed. That stands for plant root simulators. And those give us an estimate of nutrient exchange rates in the soil. So it's micrograms of a given nutrient per unit area. And then we have these PVC soil incubation cores installed to monitor nitrogen mineralization rates after fire. And we are analyzing these for an entire suite of soil properties. A lot of those are essential plant nutrients, so that includes nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and a whole suite of cations. We're also monitoring the total carbon and pyrogenic carbon in soils, which I won't be talking about today, but you can just think of that as charcoal or black carbon. And then a few other basic soil properties like pH and bulk density, which is the mass per volume. With those nutrient exchange rates that I just mentioned on the last slide, we're getting a ton of nutrient information as well. So that includes a couple of the plant available forms of nitrogen, so nitrate and ammonium, also phosphate, sulfate, and again, an entire suite of cations and metals in the soil. And today I'm just going to focus on a couple of these because we have a lot of data, and also a lot of these data are still ongoing for data collection. But I'm going to focus on nitrogen and phosphorus today for soil nutrients. And we are measuring a whole suite of additional properties at some of our plots. So those include water infiltration rates, greenhouse gas emissions, and the soil microbial community composition, which all of these are in progress as well. And today I'm just going to discuss the water infiltration rates because, like I mentioned, the barren properties of these soils have to do with them being nutrient poor and having a poor water holding status. So as you might know, fire is important because in general it mobilizes nutrients. And before fire, the majority of nutrients are stored in organic material. That includes live and dead woody material and also the herbaceous or ground vegetation layer. During fire, combustion is going to result in the loss of some nutrients to the atmosphere as they're volatilized, and those are temperature-dependent processes. And we're also going to get the formation of nutrient-rich pyrogenic materials during fire, so that includes things like ash and char that will then be deposited on the soil surface and eventually throughout the mineral soil. I just mentioned that these transformations are temperature dependent, and all that means is we know that elements will volatilize or convert to a gaseous state at specific temperature. So charcoal and ash form kind of within the range of 200 to 600 degrees, about here. And ash forming during fire is generally going to be very rich in cations or mineral substances. And that's because those cations are over on the right-hand side of the spectrum, which is implying that they have very high volatilization temperatures. So instead of being lost, they're actually condensed or concentrated in the ash. These nutrients are going to be mobilized eventually, whether that be by wind or leaching after rainfall, or they can also be taken up by recovering plant communities after fire. But generally, our expectation is that we'll see a post-fire pulse or increase in nutrient concentration as this ash is entering the soil, and then eventually a decline due to any of these mobilization processes. We know that ash is a very important source of post-fire soil nutrients, and our team has actually published a manuscript on this topic from our 2016 burn. We found that the average ash load on the landscape in Moqua post-fire was about 2,000 kilograms per hectare, and those ash samples were particularly enriched in nitrogen and cations, as you'll see at the bottom. And the exact breakdown of the nutrient composition is influenced by fire temperature, vegetation cover, and fuel load. I didn't go into all of those today, but these results are published, so you can check out that fire ecology manuscript if you're interested in those patterns further. And what's important for now is that the increases that we saw in the ash are also being reflected in the soil after burn. So I'm going to walk you through this figure really quickly. Right now I'm just showing the first panel. So this is our pre-fire or pre-burn soil phosphorus concentration. And the colors are indicating different depths. So this top layers are forest floor, upper mineral soil, and lower mineral soil. So what you'll see is after fire, the total soil phosphorus concentration increased immediately, and that was mostly due to this increase in the forest floor layer, even though there was a slight decline in the upper mineral soil. But by 1 year after fire, these phosphorus concentrations were still elevated relative to pre-fire. And what you'll also notice is that some of the forest floor phosphorus has been translocated down into mineral soil 1 year post-fire. And our plant root simulator probes also support this pattern. So we also saw a corresponding increase in the plant available phosphorus or phosphate. So in this figure, what you're looking at is the amount per area in the plant rooting zone of phosphate. And then these are burn blocks. So block D and block J, which were burned in 2018, and our reference plots. So the first thing you'll notice is that the available phosphate in that rooting zone nearly doubled after fire. Another thing you'll see is that there's just greater variation overall in phosphorus after burns, and that's likely due to quite a bit of variation in burn severity and fire behavior. And the last thing that's really important to note is that our reference plots did not show any change in available phosphorus. And that's good because that confirms that the changes we observed are in fact due to fire. But what we really want to know is what are the consequences of greater fire intensity and burn severity on soil nutrient status. So this figure is similar to the one I just showed you, looking at pre-fire, post-fire, and 1 year post-fire nutrient concentration. But in this instance, we're looking at total inorganic nitrogen, which is the sum of ammonium and nitrate in the soil. And you see a similar pattern as to what we did with phosphorus. So there's an overall increase in phosphorus concentration. Again, most of that is due to gains in the forest floor layer. And then 1 year post-fire, we do start to see a bit of a decline in this case. But what's interesting is that if we tease apart the post-fire nutrient results according to burn severity class, you'll notice that the nutrient pulse is actually dampened at a higher severity. So we're looking at National Park Service Severity Index here. These are unburned plots, and this is increasing burn severity as we go to the right. So you'll see that at higher severity burns, there's actually less available ammonium in this case. And that just has to do with that temperature-dependent volatilization figure that I showed. So at higher temperatures and higher severity, more of that nitrogen is being lost to the atmosphere, so less is available in soils. We also know that fire affects soil water availability, and that's kind of the other part of the soils being considered barrens. And that's because fire removes all these different layers that store a lot of water, like the litter, dust, and soil organic matter. And fire is also creating new substances within the soil. And those can be either hydrophilic, which means they hold water, or they can potentially repel water. And char can be an example of that. We call those hydrophobic substances. So to test this, we use this instrument you see on the left here. It's called a mini disc infiltrometer. It's basically a graduated cylinder that you put on the surface of the dust here. You can set a suction rate on it, and you just measure the rate at which water is flowing into the soils. And that's going to describe or give us an infiltration rate, which we can then convert to soil hydraulic conductivity. So we were interested in how specific soil properties relate to infiltration rates and also how burn history relates to infiltration rates. And the main thing that we found was that soil hydraulic conductivity actually shows a positive relationship with the number of burns in recent history. So here you're looking at the total number of burns that a given block or subunit of a block has received in relation to soil hydraulic conductivity, which is millimeters of water infiltrating the soil per hour. And this is just telling us that with more burns, we expect that soils might be able to return to or be maintained at these high hydraulic conductivity conditions, which are great because those conditions will actually favor native barrens plant communities and limit woody encroachment by keeping water status low. So a few take-home messages from this section for right now. We saw that dust consumption and soil heating were minimal, which tells us we may want to consider burning when dust is drier. We did see that soil nutrients respond to fire, but generally effects seem to be ephemeral and sometimes minimal. We also saw that plots which have been burned many times relative to unburned reference plots or newly restored plots have higher hydraulic conductivity. And this is telling us that it seems likely that frequent and repeated burns are necessary for prescribed fire to have the effects that we want it to have and for that to be persistent. For example, maintaining thin dust layers and a low organic matter content in soils. And just to wrap up, we want to return to that Nowacki and Abrams paper on musification to think about barrens restoration. So we've talked about how prescribed fire can decrease nutrient stocks and increase soil hydraulic conductivity. And we think that this might have the potential to restore barrens, especially in Moqua, where the underlying conditions are quite xeric. So we are in kind of these early stages of musification, which we've referred to as woody densification. And that means that we probably still have a very good chance of reversing that woody densification and restoring soil conditions to a barren state that once again supports the native pine barrens plant species that are very tolerant of drought and low nutrient conditions like sweet fern and blueberries. And with that, we do want to thank a lot of people, especially the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, because none of this work would be possible without all of their assistance throughout the project. And we really want to emphasize that the Moqua Barrens Project is a true management research collaboration. We get by with help from not only the National Forest, but also the Washburn Ranger District. So we'd specifically like to thank Brian Hringa, Jen Raybuck, Vance Hazelton, Dan Hinson, Michelle Davalos, Robert Lieberman, and Matt Bushman, who's now down in North Carolina. We've had countless field support and field assistance throughout the years. And also, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the rest of the research team who did not speak today. So Matt, Brian, and I spoke on behalf of our full research team, which also includes Randy Kolka, Jessica Meisel, Crystal Kern, and Dion Donner. So I think with that, we would love to take any questions that you might have at this point.
Thank you, guys. For all the audience, if you got questions, type them in the chat box. And we'll start with one from Craig. Craig Meyer asked, were the cameras and the plots covered in the method? So if you could describe some of the camera instrumentation.
Right. This is Matt. No, I didn't talk about how they were done. Those are cameras set at 10 feet above ground, looking over the plots, and there's it's a 1 second frame capture, and they're in insulated boxes looking through a stove glass, so they survive the fire and can monitor fire behavior.
Okay. Well, let's give it a few minutes, and folks type your questions into the chat box. And we'll wait and see if there's other questions. Do you have next steps for this, Brian or Kathleen or Matt, or for the rest of the research team?
So this is Brian speaking. We have one more year of field work to do. So we've got our 1 year post-burn in soil and vegetation from the 2018 burn. So some of that work is still in progress. And now that we've got the infrastructure in place, it begs, as with any research project, it opens up a whole suite of new questions. And so we certainly are interested in pursuing some of those new questions if we can pursue the funding for those. But we do have one more year left of 1 year post-burn data collection to go.
Okay. Yeah. And what would be some of those questions that you have?
Well, of course.
Does that have to do with seasonality, I assume?
Yeah, the one that sticks out very clearly is now that we've well documented what happens in these late season burns, both above ground and quite a bit below ground. Now, repeating some of those same questions under growing season conditions. We just from what we've seen and what we've read and learned from looking at growing season burns, they have done some recent growing season burns now in the Muckwa, and you can see there's more heterogeneity in terms of the top kill that can occur there. But we expect to have greater heterogeneity below ground as well. So there's a lot of interesting questions to pursue there in particular.
Okay.
I do see a question here. Any recommendations for an ideal return burn interval? That's honestly a great question. And I think one of the things that the study does offer with more digging is looking more closely into the burn history. And so, in some cases, some of the plots had not been burned at all, and before this experiment took place. In other cases, there's been a long history of burning. And so one of the things that we'd like to pursue is part of that question. Frequency is, first we want to see number of burns as Kathleen has shown in the hydraulic connectivity, but frequency we should be able to get as well. So it's a great question, but I don't know that we have an answer for you right now.
Yeah, and I can add to that. There's actually a 2016 publication that reports on the historic fire return intervals. And so pre-European settlement, it was about a 9-year fire return interval. And that's gotten bumped up to 15 years after settlement, and it's now over a 40-year fire return interval. So historically, it was about 9 years.
And I guess last comment on this is, so the blocks that were burned, I and F, were burned in 2016, are now on the schedule to be burned now in 2019. So just to give you a sense. So they are doing a fairly frequent burn rotation at this point.
All right. Let's see if there's any more questions coming in. And one thing that jumped out at me when you showed some of the slides talking about mesofication, I guess looking at that, the barrens restorations may be a little easier, so to speak, because you're already starting with more nutrient deficient soils. Is that your thinking or not?
It is. I think, in a way, it's kind of the best case scenario. That mesification process happens across the board, but one of the things that's been documented is not here, but in other studies, is that the more mesic you are, there were systems that were pretty open and yet still mesic just because of the burn frequency that occurred there. But those are the ones that are really converting more rapidly towards that right-hand side to a state that's very difficult to burn. And so, we're really working, even in some cases where things have converted over to hardwood forest, there's still a lot of work to do, but it's on that right-hand side, or excuse me, that left-hand side of the spectrum. It's a little bit simpler to work with there than it is if you move far to the right.
And definitely. All right, well, let's give it just a few more minutes, see if there's other questions coming in. But did you have any other thoughts from the team? Plus, I know you have a couple people sitting with you in the wings.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment on that. So far, so good.
Looking like a quiet group.
That's right.
All right. Well, we'll start wrapping this up to see if there's any last-minute questions coming in. So this webinar is being recorded, so if you missed it or missed portions of it or want to share this with somebody, I'll be getting the recording back up on the website here. It should be later this afternoon. And there's also a PDF version of this if you're looking for any specific slides. The web page also has the contact information for all the researchers. And with that, let's see, not seeing any more questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I'd really like to thank Brian, Matt, and Kathleen, and everyone for joining us this afternoon. Any last thoughts, Brian, Matt, or Kathleen?
This is Brian. Again, I just want to thank the Lake States Fire Science Consortium for the opportunity to speak. It really is a novel thing for us to be able to have this kind of reach, so I really appreciate that. And I want to mention, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium has contributed a couple of interns to related questions in this study, so we're much appreciated for that as well.
That's good. Thank you. Yes. All right, guys. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. If there are any questions after the fact, you can look on the webpage and find the contact information or get a hold of me, and we'll put you in contact with the researchers. So thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.